The weakness of the Directory, 7 and 45. The first formally constituted French Republic, known as the Directory, lasted only 4 years. It was politically weak and vulnerable because it rested on an extremely narrow social base, and it presupposed certain military conquests. The new constitution applied not only to France, but also to the southern Netherlands, territory that would become Belgium after 1830, which was now regarded as incorporated constitutionally into the French Republic. The Habsburgs had not yet ceded this land to France, nor had the British agreed to accept French occupation, so the Constitution of 1795 committed the Republic to a program of successful military and political expansion. At the same time, it restricted the politically active class. It gave almost all adult males the vote, but they voted only for electors. Persons chosen as electors were usually men of some means, able to give their time and willing to take part in public life. This, in effect, meant men of the upper middle class, because the old nobility was disaffected. The electors chose all important department officials and also the members of the National Legislative Assembly, which was now divided into 2 chambers. The lower chamber was called the Council of 500. The upper, composed of 250 members, the Council of Ancients being those over 40. The chambers chose the executive, which was called the Directory, from which the whole regime took its name and was made up of 5 directors. The Constitution of 1795. The government was thus constitutionally in the hands of substantial property owners, but its real base was narrower still. In the reaction after Thermidor, many people began to consider restoring the monarchy. The convention, to protect its own members, had ruled that 2/3 of the men initially elected to the Council of 500 and Council of Ancients must be ex-members of the convention. This interference with the freedom of the elections provoked serious disturbances in Paris, instigated mainly by royalists. The convention, having now accustomed itself to using the army, instructed a young general named Bonaparte, who happened to be in Paris, to put down the royalist mob. He did so with a whiff of grape shot. The new constitutional republic thus made itself dependent on military protection at the outset. The regime had enemies to both right and left. On the right, undisguised royalists agitated in Paris and even in the 2 councils, and they were in continuous touch with the late king's brother, the Count of Provence, whom they regarded as Louis VIII. Louis XVI's son, who died in prison, was counted as Louis XIII. Louis XIII had installed himself at Verona in Italy, where he headed a propaganda agency financed largely by British money. The worst obstacle to the resurgence of royalism in France was Louis XIII himself. In 1795, on assuming the title, he had issued a Declaration of Verona, in which he announced his intention to restore the old regime and punish all involved in the revolution back to 1789. It has been said, correctly enough in this connection, that the Bourbons learned nothing and forgot nothing. Had Louis VIII offered in 1795 what he offered in 1814, it is quite conceivable that his partisans in France might have brought about his restoration and terminated the war. As it was, the majority of the French adhered not exactly to the Republic as set up in 1795, but to any system that would shut out the 746 Bourbons and privileged nobility, prevent a reimposition of the manorial system, and secure the new landowners, peasant and bourgeois, in the possession of the church properties that they had purchased. The left was made up of persons from various levels of society who still favored the more democratic ideas expressed earlier in the revolution. Some of them thought that the fall of Robespierre had been a great misfortune. A tiny group of extremists formed the Conspiracy of Equals, organized in 1796 by Gracchus Babeuf. His intention was to overthrow the Directory and replace it with a dictatorial government in which private property would be abolished and equality would be decreed. For these ideas, and for his activist program, he has been regarded as a political precursor to modern communism. The Directory repressed the Conspiracy of Equals without difficulty and guillotined Babeuf. Meanwhile, it did nothing to relieve the distress of the lower classes, who showed little inclination to follow Babeuf, even though they suffered from the ravages of scarcity and inflation. The political crisis of 1797. 7 and 47. In March 1797 occurred the first really free election ever held in France under Republican auspices. The successful candidates were for the most part constitutional monarchists, or at least vaguely royalist. A change of the balance within the 500 and the ancients in favor of royalism seemed to be impending. This was precisely what most of the Republicans of 1793, including the regicides, could not endure, even though they had to violate the Constitution to prevent it. Nor was it endurable, for other reasons, to General Napoleon Bonaparte. Bonaparte was born in 1769 into the minor nobility of Corsica, shortly after the annexation of Corsica to France. He had studied in French military schools and been commissioned in the Bourbon army, but would never have reached high rank under the conditions of the old regime. In 1793, he was a fervent young Jacobin officer who had served the revolutionary cause by driving the British from Toulon, and who was consequently made a brigadier general by the government of the Terror. In 1795, as noted, he rendered valuable service to the convention by breaking up a demonstration of royalists. In 1796, he received command of an army with which, in 2 brilliant campaigns, he crossed the Alps and drove the Austrians from North Italy. Like other generals, he soon became independent from the government in Paris, which was financially too harassed to pay his troops or to supply him. He lived by local requisitions in Italy, became self-supporting, and in fact made the civilian government in Paris dependent on him. Napoleon Bonaparte, 748. He developed a foreign policy of his own. Many Italians had become dissatisfied with their old governments, so that the arrival of the French Republican armies threw North Italy into turmoil. Combining with some of the Italian revolutionaries, Bonaparte established a Cisalpine republic in the Po Valley, modeled on the French system, with Milan as its capital. Where the Directory on the whole had originally meant to return Milan to the Austrians in compensation for Austrian recognition of the French conquest of the Austrian Netherlands, Bonaparte insisted that France hold its position in both the Netherlands and Italy. He therefore needed expansionist Republicans in the government in Paris, and was perturbed by the royalist victories in the elections of 1797. The Austrians negotiated with Bonaparte because they had been beaten by him in battle. The British also, in conferences with the French at Lille, discussed peace in 1796 and 1797. The war had gone badly for England. A party of Whigs led by Charles James Fox had always openly disapproved it, and the pro-French and Republican radicals were so active that the government suspended habeas corpus in 1794 and thereafter imprisoned political agitators at its discretion. Crops were bad and bread was scarce and costly. England too suffered from inflation, for Pitt at first financed the war by extensive loans, and a good deal of gold had been shipped to the continent to finance the Allied armies. The Austrians, Britain's only remaining ally, had nevertheless been routed by Bonaparte, and at the moment the British could subsidize them no further. The British had every reason to make peace. Prospects for peace, therefore, seemed good in the summer of 1797, but, as always, it would be peace upon certain conditions. It was the royalists in France that were the peace party, because a restored king could easily return the conquests of the Republic and would, in any case, abandon the new republics in Holland and the Po Valley. The Republicans in the French government could make peace with difficulty, if at all. They were constitutionally bound to retain the southern Netherlands. They were losing control of their own generals. Nor could the supreme question be evaded. Was peace dear enough to purchase by a return of the old regime, such as Louis VIII had himself promised? Prospects for peace? The coup d'etat of Fructidor chronology of notable events, 1789-1804. May 1789, a States General convenes at Versailles, 749. The coup d'etat of Fructidor, September 4th, 1797, was a forceful attempt to resolve all these internal and external issues. It was the turning point for France's constitutional republic, and it became a decisive event for all Europe. The Directory asked for help from Bonaparte, who sent one of his generals, Augereau, to Paris. While Augereau stood by with a force of soldiers, the councils annulled most of the elections of the preceding spring. On the whole, It was the old Republicans of the convention who secured themselves in power. Their justification was that they were defending the revolution, keeping out Louis VIII and the old regime. But to do so, they had violated their own constitution and quashed the first free election ever held in a constitutional French republic. And they had become more than ever dependent on the army. After the coup d'etat, the Fructidorian government broke off negotiations with England. With Austria, it signed the Treaty of Campo Formio on October 17, 1797, incorporating Bonaparte's ideas. By the new treaty, Austria recognized the French annexation of the former Austrian Netherlands, the French right to incorporate the left bank of the Rhine, and the French-dominated Cisalpine Republic in Italy. In return, Bonaparte allowed the Austrians to annex Venice and most of mainland Venetia. In the following months, under French auspices, revolutionary republicanism spread rapidly through much of Italy, creating new republics with classical names. The old patrician Republic of Genoa turned into a Ligurian republic on the French model. At Rome, the Pope was deposed from his temporal power, and a Roman republic was established. In southern Italy, a Neapolitan republic, also called Parthenopean, was set up. In Switzerland at the same time, Swiss reformers cooperated with the French to create a new Helvetic republic. Revolutionary republicanism spread 751. The French Republic and its satellites, 1798 to 1799. By 1799, the French Republic had annexed the former Austrian Netherlands and the small German bishoprics and principalities west of the Rhine, and had created, with the aid of native sympathizers, a string of lesser revolutionary republics in the Dutch Netherlands, Switzerland, and most of Italy. With the Treaty of Campo Formio between France and Austria in 1797, the Holy Roman Empire began to disintegrate, for the German princes of the left bank of the Rhine, who were dispossessed when their territories went to France, began to be compensated with territory of the church states of the Holy Roman Empire. These developments were carried further in the following decade by Napoleon, see map, p. 4 and 33. 752. The left bank of the Rhine, in the atomistic Holy Roman Empire, was occupied by a great many German princes who now had to vacate their lands. The Treaty of Campo Formio provided that they be compensated by church territories in Germany, east of the Rhine, and that France have a hand in this territorial reconstruction of Germany. The German princes turned greedy eyes on the German bishops and abbots, and the almost 1,000-year-old empire, hardly more than a solemn political abstraction since the Peace of Westphalia, sank to the level of a land rush or real estate speculation. The coup d'etat of 1799. Bonaparte, 753. After Fructidor, the idea of maintaining the republic as a free or constitutional government was given up. There were more uprisings, more quashed elections, more purgings both to left and right. The Directory turned into an ineffective dictatorship. It repudiated most of the assignats and the debt, but failed to restore financial confidence or stability. Guerrilla activity flared up again in the Vendée and other parts of western France. The religious schism became more acute. The Directory had to take severe measures toward the refractory clergy. Meanwhile, Bonaparte waited for the situation to ripen. Returning from Italy a conquering hero, he was assigned to command the army in training to invade England. He concluded that invasion was premature and decided to strike indirectly at England by threatening India in a spectacular invasion of Egypt. In 1798, outwitting the British fleet, he landed a French army at the mouth of the Nile. Egypt was part of the Ottoman Empire, and the French occupation of Egyptian territories alarmed the Russians, who had their own designs on the Middle East. The Austrians objected to the French rearrangement of Germany. A year and a half after the Treaty of Campo Formio, Austria, Russia, and Great Britain formed an alliance known as the Second Coalition. The French Republic was again involved in a general war, and the war went unfavorably, for in August 1798, the British fleet cut off the French army in Egypt by winning the Battle of the Nile, or Abu Qir. In October, the people of Cairo rose in revolt against the French occupation of Egypt, and by 1799, Russian forces under Marshal Suvorov were operating as far west as Switzerland and North Italy, where the Cisalpine Republic went down in ruin. Recognizing the obstacles to his ambitions in the Middle East, as well as the multiple threats to France's revolutionary republic, General Bonaparte decided that he could best pursue his own interests in Paris. He therefore abandoned his army in Egypt, slipped through the British fleet, and reappeared unexpectedly in France, where he found that certain civilian leaders in the Directory were planning a change. They included CAS, of whom little had been heard since he wrote What is the Third Estate in 1789, but who had sat in the convention and voted for the death of Louis XVI. CAA's formula was now confidence from below, authority from above. What he now wanted of the people was acquiescence, and of the government, power to act. This group was looking about for a general, and their choice fell on the sensational young Bonaparte, who was still only 30. Dictatorship by an army officer was repugnant to most Republicans of the 500 and the ancients. Bonaparte, CAAs, and their followers therefore resorted to force, executing the coup d'état of Brumaire, November 9, 1799, in which armed soldiers drove the legislators from the chambers. They proclaimed a new form of the Republic, which Bonaparte entitled the Consulate. It was headed by 3 consuls, with Bonaparte as the first consul. The Directory turns to Bonaparte,